topics of today, what I want to talk about is, 98 to 2, or even if you want to back it up to a Ford frame, pre-98, and then 03 and up. So, in reality, we all know in the sport of demolition derby, every year the older model cars become less available, less solid, especially in the Northeast. So, the reality is this: the 03 and up Ford is pretty much, in my opinion, the car that's going to carry this sport predominantly warhorse for the next classes for years. I mean, I'd say that's probably a pretty fair assessment because they're readily available. It's one of the more reasonable cars you can still buy. It's one of the most competitive cars you can buy out of the box. We're going to talk about some of those things that I feel make that car competitive. And then we're also going to discuss some topics about, the Achilles heels versus maybe some myths with the 03 that everybody hears a little bit here and there. But does anybody, as we go through this, ask some questions if you have. I'm going to ask you guys some questions because I like interactive stuff. Because at this time of the weekend and after preparing for this event, I'm surprised I can even talk without stammering. So, anyway, the two biggest difference between these generations of Fords, when I say generations, it's because these are two completely different manufactured type platforms. Okay? This was where Ford started with a modular type platform, where the frame was a segregated unit versus suspension components, hence the aluminum cradle, self-contained suspension steering. So automobile manufacturers, every year, they try to do things better, safer. But the big key is, how do we manufacture cars faster? Well, you make them easier to put together, right? So, of course, back in the 70s, when a lot of the old irons were built, things weren't like they were today. Labor was cheap, products were cheap, materials were cheap. So that's why when you look at all the old stainless steel screws and everything, today, you're not going to find that. So the biggest difference between these generations of frames is this is your typical C-channel type frame. What that means is it's not an old C-channel like the old cars that just had a single C. It's two formed pieces put together to make a framework, and then it's welded. Some of the faults with this is, and everybody's seen it, especially in the 70s cars, but specifically on these, whenever you take two members and you put it together and you weld it, it's not as good as, say, a solid tube. Okay? Now, where these come in, these use what's called, on the front part, they still use basically the same manufacturing process from straight across the back. All right? Hydroforming is how they made this front frame section. Okay? Now, the big advantage with hydroforming, it's a manufacturing process that basically uses pressure and fluid to form something into a die or mold. Okay? The advantage with that is you can get unique shapes, you can use better grade materials, and you get consistency throughout what you're working with. So where here, when you start adding pieces and processes and components, you get inconsistency. How many people have ever had a car that works on and you find a frame seam or a dingus in the frame for some odd reason? How many people have ever found that? All the time. It's almost impossible to find that in a hydroform frame. When you look at these frames, you're like, well, gee, really, 9802s almost seem thicker. Well, in some aspects they are, but this is a better material. And it's one piece, okay? And it doesn't have any distinct bends or shapes in it. There's a term, it's called section modulus, which is used in engineering, okay? And what that is that's based on frame shape and tensile strength. Has anybody ever heard that term before? Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's real simple. If you already put a bend in something, it's technically already bent, correct? So that's why when you see a lot of guys just slap a plate on a frame, and you actually see the frame bend, and you're like, I can't believe that bend. You know, I put a plate on it. Well, you put a bend in the plate, right? So that's why you see today with a lot of different products, they have different formations in them, even though they go on the side of the frame. It's because what you're trying to do is change the shape of the member, okay? You notice on these, anything that has a radius, notice I said radius, not bend. It has a smoother radius over a longer area, so it's a longer transition. That's why these cars are strong, okay? It's not 100,000 yield tensile strength. It's better, but it's not 100,000 yield PSI. What's the craziest thing anybody ever heard about these cars? Somewhere. I mean, I've had people tell me, well, they're made out of like 90,000 yield material. Nah, probably not. Ford's too cheap, all the auto manufacturers. No, it's because when you look at them now, and a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you probably naturally makes sense, correct? So, when you pick these cars, and you know, and here's some things that go on today. And we talked about this last night with a bunch of promoters. These cars, and these cars, a lot of people aren't familiar with these. They're only familiar with them when they see them out there on the track, just taking it to people. Okay, and they're like, oh, it's an 03. Well, here's what happens. When you write rule sets, and you're allowed to do the same stuff to this car that you can do to this car, it changes it into an animal. And in my opinion, I don't believe it's fair for these cars to be discriminated against in rules like, oh, you can run that, but you have to run the factory aluminum spindles. You've got to do this. You can't have a bumper bracket. They're just, in my opinion, they're just good out rules. Don't handicap the guy or make him work harder. That's my opinion. Now, and also one of the things is, if you hear the guy say, I don't want one of them aluminum cradles are junk, they'll break. I've seen these break, but compared to the amount of them that have broken, the car is usually a mess when they break. We're talking wire car, frame rail up in the air, it breaks. These aluminum cradles are very strong, okay? A lot of very smart people at a big place design these things to hold the wheels and the suspension of the engine of the vehicle and sustain crashes. So the engineering's there, okay? The engineering wasn't there for demolition derby, all right? So now we're trying to figure things out. So, okay, the biggest differences between these when it comes to suspension is, everyone says, well, let's go to aluminum lower. Well, you can change it to a steel lower. We have a set of moves right in our boot. Okay. An actual 03 and up, lower control arm, steel one, and I've had other opinions from people, is one of the strongest lower control arms made. Period. These are one piece, they're standard. These are two pieces and they're put together well. 03 and ups, in my opinion, have one of the strongest OEM cross members ever made in the vehicle. The way it's made and put together, okay? The 03 and up versus the 98 to 02, from straight rail from here to here, look at how much webbing you have in this frame, okay? These cars here, from here up, you can do all you want. Historically, how many of you see going a straight rail sooner or later?
All of
them. Every one of them, right? How many of these do you ever see going straight rail? If they're going to go, it's usually in the back, and that's usually because you don't have something quite right, or it's a downsized stock show where something's going to go anyway. So, as you get through these cars, that's the biggest difference. And people say, well, I won't run an 03 because I can't keep the wheels on. Well, if you look out there and you look at some of the stuff that guys are doing, it's simple. Steel lower control arms. And I honestly don't know how many guys are on the aluminum, but I know guys have run them and they survive. The steel lower control arm. There's two types of uppers. There's this style, which is like the solid steel, and then there's a stamp style operator. So there's two different A-arms on the stock Ford Vic. A lot of guys are changing these and going to some other A-arms that you can get a little better geometry when you change spindles. My nephew Dane did a thing on geometry, steering, suspension. How many of you guys sat through that? Okay. He's a pretty sharp cat when it comes to things. So what he was talking about, and if everybody paid attention, was when you talk about Ford spindles, when you do spindle swaps versus the GM spindles, the distance and the height affects where your top ball joint's going to land with the A-line geometry. So those are all little things. So the same things you still try to do when you build these cars like these on the Ford. You know, no matter what you do for a spindle and your ball joints, you still got to keep your geometry correct. Okay. And this uses the biggest difference between these two is the steering system. Rack and pinion versus a box. Whether you use a 2-bolt box, 4-bolt box. You know, one of the guys built the boxing, you know, hydrosphere box and whatever. Steering box, rack and pinion. Everybody understands the difference between those pretty much. How they work. And if you don't, and you've never been exposed to these cars, just because you don't know about them doesn't mean that you can't raise your hand and say. Because if you don't know about something, the best thing to do is ask a question. All right. Rack and pinions have been used. They're used in trophy trucks. They're used in all the automotive applications today. They're used in late models. So the fact that rack and pinion steering doesn't work in this sport has got to be one of the most incorrect statements. Can it get broke? Well, sure it can get broke. If you hit anything, you can break it. So going back to that, a lot of guys always look for parts to compensate for their driving ability. Okay? You can only do so much to a car, put such a high quality part on it, and if you still let people beat the wheels off of your car, you're really testing the abilities of Ford, the parts builders, and everybody else. So if you're not getting things right and you're coming out of derbies and you're losing wheels, like I tell kids, if you want to gauge yourself as a driver, when you come out of a heat race and you had fresh wheels on, walk around and look at your tires and your wheels. If you got a ding and a goober and a plugger and a vent on every wheel, you're not doing a good job as a driver. Does everybody agree with that? I mean, everybody's going to get hit in the wheel. But my point being is don't rely on them parts and be like, I don't have to drive out of this. I don't have to drive smart. Right, Rick? Do you agree with that? Yep. Parts get you so far. They work far better when they're not beat to crap. So, because there's going to come a point where you're just going to have to use it. So, the miss with the rack and pinion not being a very good system is wrong. It is a good system. One of the things that can break any steering component, even a steering box, is over travel. If you over travel a steering box or you over travel a rack and pinion, you can break either one of them. Okay? And you got a rope and you run to the end of it, it gives you a bad effect, right? The same thing happens with mechanical components. This thing cycles clear to one side, somebody beans the wheel and it jams that thing. All kinds of bad stuff going on. Just like the steering box. Okay? If you like to drive up inside the back of station wagons, doesn't matter. Anything you got underneath that car is going to get cleaned off. Rack and pinion, steering box, you name it. So a lot of these parts get a bad rap because guys just assume, oh, it's a weak part. Well, none of this stuff that we ever do with these cars, that any of the manufacturers say, you know what, this is going to make a dang good derby car. So that's the big differences between these cars, okay? These cars do some weird stuff compared to these cars, okay? Just building these cars, when you start messing around, putting motors in them and picking them up and down, and especially you get a body on them and that, the difference between this kind of frame and this frame, these are resilient, okay? Which means they have a memory in them. You've seen this probably. These cars will go across the track. hit something, you drove them, you'll hit something, you find whack, and you're like, oh, and you're like, wait a minute. These cars flex anywhere that I've saw, and what guys that know these cars, anywhere from 7 to 11 inches. That's a lot. So the key is make sure you have a lot of slide in these columns, okay? And make sure they're free, like, because that will mess up the traction. Over traveling the steering, that's over base enemy of these track. All right. We make a product, I'm going to plug it here. We sold them all today, and I'll show you. The biggest roll thing that comes into these cars is, well, these are so easy to mount an engine in compared to this car. Well, we make a product, and it works great, but it's not legal everywhere. And other people make products too to solve this problem. It's either a bolt-in or a weld-in cradle. I mean, depending upon rules, and this opens up another can of worms with these cars. But we make an engine mount that simply falls right onto these boxes right here and locates. It's got GMK member geometry, so you can put a small block Chevy in it pretty easily. Okay? And you just flip your strut reinforcements down and pull it down. It's got weld tabs that are loaded in the bolt. So how you put the engines in these cars is pretty important. You got all this space, but the difference is with how much wiggle you got in these cars. I've seen guys in the wire approach for hobby stock classes. I know one guy last year, they went through 11 transmissions. Okay. These cars do this a lot, and if you look here, you have no cross member other than this cradle in the car. It's aluminum. The other thing these cars do is they go like this. All right, so if you got this, and you got this, you got something locked down in this car very hard, and a stock transmission, stock motor mount. I mean, do the math. I mean, just stuff's gonna bust. So when you put things in these cars, in a wire car, or a sub stock, or all these promoters got so many names classes. Hobby stock, stock, wire glass. But anyway, if you follow me with a stock platform, you better make sure stuff's going to move. Our engine mount is slotted. People say, why don't you just make it so it falls over that and weld it right to the frame? The reason we made it the way we do is it's slotted, so when it falls on top of these bosses, it sits on top, not around it. And if you bolt that down, your engine is bolted that cross member, it stays in there, and everything can float around it if need be. So if this thing gets jacked real hard on a corner, it doesn't twist it and snap your transmission off. Now, did we precisely calculate that? No. But by design, we know these things move around a lot, and we know they need room to wiggle. And our engine mount's intended to be used up to, a heavy super stock. So, and it seems to be working. All right. You can buy, like O3 Nation's got a really nice piece in there, that cradle, or engine mount cradle. They remember they make beautiful piece of work. I mean, it's nice craftsmanship. I mean, clean part, looks great. Looks like something you're not going to use in a stock platform, probably very good in a limited weld mount. So, the other thing that's distinctly different in these cars, my nephew Dane touched on it earlier, sway bars. Okay, I think he had it like 04 and up. The sway bars are made out of a significantly different material than the 98 02 sway bar. These ones here you often see freight. On these ones here, you rarely ever see freight. It's a completely different material. It seems to be pliable, bendable, weldable, you name it. It doesn't seem great. So when you're, depending upon roll sets, you do sway bar manipulations, very easy sway bar to work with if you're a builder. These here, not so much. They're strong, but they have a tendency to break, especially when you get the frame rails working independently and not together. It seems like anytime you get one going askew, it's not. So Outside of that, like I said, from here back visibly, there's not much difference. They pretty much kept everything. You know, even the watch link brackets. Okay. One thing that we started doing last year, and some promoters like it, some just don't buy it. The rear trailing arm brackets right here. Everybody goes to a watch link kit, and it's real easy to do. Everybody builds them. You can buy the kits. You put your lower control arm in here just like you order stock Ford, correct? We actually started mounting our lowers outward. We're running it right here before we put it. I haven't. We did that. I don't know how many other guys. Anybody ever tried that? Well, I'll tell you why we did it. And it's real simple. When you look at the frames on these cars, what do you see right there? A big indentation, right? And what did we talk about when I spoke about frames already having a bend or a contour or whatever in them? What's that thing wanting to do right there? Okay. How many guys cut this bracket off or shove it in? Anybody can snip them off, leave it a flat frame like I would suggest leaving that bracket on just because it does help that area. A lot of guys say, well, what about wheel clearance? What about that? Oh, they clear the wheels on the cars on the road. Granted, you're not getting poundage or whatever, but if you choose your wheel offset correctly, and your rear end width's correct, you can run a lower control arm on the outside of this. I brought this up to a lot of promoters, and I said, you know, you have a watch link conversion. Traditionally, everybody goes in board the frame, and it's all good. I'll hear it. We drove this car through inspection in a few different shows, and you know, they were like, wanting to say something about it, but it's like, well, we just built a similar, well, not even near the size of what you normally do on the inside. We put on the outside. What we found is historically these cars will start pushing the humps around the gas tank protector and start dumping. Well, we ran this car, I don't know how many times last year, and with that outer bracket, and the frame was literally non-deformed and had not a single wiggle. I'm assuming because of that bracket, fixing that area, that's what helped. Another thing, in my opinion, you have control arms coming off the rear differential. They're coming at an angle toward the center of the car. Okay. A typical 4-bar type suspension and that suspension axle is all built for ride and travel, and it works good. When you have a frame that comes in this way, and you put a bracket on it, your bars go this way. Anybody ever been on a track going backwards and you catch something with your rear tire real hard? You know, and your sheet metal starts going away? Or somebody's out there, most guys chasing you around are going after the main thing, wheels. So if they're hitting your wheel, every time they hit you, they're shoving that rear end ahead, shoving that rear end ahead. Well, if you have something pushing this way, and you got that divot right there, it's trying to bend this frame. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the best way to build a car. I'm just saying this makes pretty good sense. So when you have those arms going in and that thing's hitting, it's trying to bend that frame in. So it's wanting to take the humps around, okay? The other thing is, if it's that arm's in line with that frame rail, it's pushing straight into the straight rail. Okay. So these cars naturally seem to perform better in the straight rail, so why not try to get the energy of the car going into that? You know, unlike the 9802s, these things, I mean, they'll only take so much stress from the straight rails to kind of go through it, and they all start doing something. So that's one thing we did different. We've seen a pretty significant result in it. I don't know if a lot of promoters will let it fly, but you know, like my nephew Dane said, if you're going to do some shady stuff, that's probably a good area to do it. You know, so does that make sense to everybody?
Are you saying going to the stock mounts and split yours right up to the
Yeah, what we did is, we just took the rule as, you're allowed to do a watch link conversion, and they said you can put the mount for your trailer. Because most super stock and up shows let you use either go to a 2x2, you can run an aftermarket trailing on, whatever, you can fabricate a mounting bracket. So we just chose to put the fabricated bracket out here. You understand?
Yeah. The reason I would go on the inside is that way when it packs in, it's packing up against your gas tank. It's pulling in. And I think that it would help it. Like, get stuff in, like, closing like a fist.
Well, what I'm talking about is any stresses going into the radio. Right. Your lower control arm is going to the bottom of your hip. Right? So, if you look at what I've seen is all four. What we saw is in 2019, the car we built for Kansas, we had the control arms on the inside. So the hump stayed straight. We rolled that thing clear. It came clear around the gas tank. The back tires center around the gas. These humps were pushed clear in. The frame was kinked in here, but then these went into it. Okay? So even if you have a heavy gas tank, because you don't tie it in there, these humps will start pushing around the front. We're just going to start this thing. So this indentation right here on the frame, it's already got the frame.
Yeah, you're driving.
So all your thought on that thing goes, that is all at once. And that frame pushes in. You know, like the frame.
Right.
That's what you're trying to do there. As soon as that deforms more, it naturally wants to follow that. You know, probably a lot of guys buy this in that area. Yeah, shades. That's going to be an interesting set. Shady stuff. No more gray area. Shady stuff. All blue. So that's really the big differences between these cars. You know, like I said, in my opinion, I mean, these cars, there's no doubt that the front frame rails in these cars, stock for stock, are dominant. I mean, when you can start going, you know, A-arm forward plating and stuff on top. And that's another thing, you know, the debate, you do your plates on the side of the frame or on top of it. I always like to ask this question. Who thinks the side of the frame is better than on top of it? Side of the frame versus on top.
Yeah.
In your opinion, why do you think that's better?
The brake will come up. You feel stronger this way.
Okay. So when you look at this frame of the car, inside, does it have any bends in it? Does it look pretty straight?
Pretty straight.
Okay. So what I'm talking about is when you bend a plate, okay, keep in mind we're in the middle bend of bends. So when you bend a plate, you already put the bend in it.
Right.
So the key is, when you look at some things, changing the shape of the frame is generally more key. That's why a lot of the plates you see that you can buy now, they've got the deformation on it. It's because of that. Because you're changing the shape. And that goes back to, you can only put the plate on the side of the frame. If you're going to put it on the side of the frame, the best way to do it is to use a plate that's not flat. Because now you're changing that overall shape. Because I'll tell you straight up, just plating on the side of the frame, if it's 12 inches, put it on top of it. It's close to strong.
See, I'm thinking back, I may have seen a car get plated tail, and if you plate just the top of it, then you go down that.
You're saying it's maybe behind the foot.
Yeah.
And especially on the 98 to 04, because I think everybody knows most of these things that go, you know, right here most of the time if you don't get somewhere. So it's all going to be dependent upon the rule and how long it takes. You know what I mean? Like some of the rules you see, like you use a 6-inch bumper plate. I mean, in reality, some of these cars 6 inches if you wonder if it's worth the time. You know what I mean? So at that point, you're better to use the shock. But that's some of the stuff that, you know, like I say in this business, and we see it everywhere. You see a guy doing something, so you do it because he's doing it. You know, and like my nephew Dane said earlier, look outside of the sport to get some different ideas, because that's how things get better. You know, trust me, 90% of the things you see when somebody catches on to something, the first time, it's usually by mistake. You didn't realize what you did, and you're like, ah, look how that worked out. So then you do it again, and it proves the theory that, hey, it does work. And then pretty soon you got that one little thing, you know. Like I said about the way we were mounting our trailer mount. I don't know if that's 100% way better, but I know it fixed an area that we seem failing in the park. You know, some promoters flat out said, no.
I wouldn't have thought to put it out there. You know, I would thought keeping it in, and that was just the way I would.
Well, just the way we always do it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm working on the fender I had, I ran your trade over in it, and I did weld the L-right. I was thinking down the line, if you could get back out, and all that, but I think it ended up screwing me not doing that, because it's the frame behind the aluminum. No,
Oh,
directly behind the aluminum on the inside.
yeah. See, what happens in these cars is everybody's seen these a lot of times. If you can run any kind of bumper bracket on the front, these cars rarely will bend up here, and they all bend at the firewall. Most of these cars will bend at the firewall. Well, what happens is, and sometimes when you loosen these strut brackets up, you'll see these frames go twing. Some of them will kind of twing in, some of them will just stay the way they are. But what happens is, as this thing starts to want to bend, it wants to do things, because there was never anything in here up top that would hold the frame. So these frame rails want to start falling in, okay? When they start falling in, okay, you want them to keep that vertical shape because they're stronger like this, all right? So if these things start falling in, they get out of a certain position where they're the strongest, and then that's when they really start going. So one thing our engine mount does do, talking about them weld tabs, guys will say, well, our promoter only lets you hold it in. Well, that's fine. Put your engine mount in, push the tabs tight against the frame, weld it to the engine mount, don't weld it to the frame, just keep them tight. That way it helps keep the frame in that position. Because if you take the tabs out, it leaves that gap and it can push in.
That's what it did.
And then what you'll find out is it ends up either pushing right tight against the inside of the mount. Or it goes out against, yeah. So our engine mount does kind of help these cars in some aspects. I gotta say how much because, but it does. So, but primarily that's what these cars do. It's two different. Anybody got any questions on anything? Or disagree with, I mean, like, you brought up a good point about the watts conversion. You know, it works fine, doing what we did. We just ran across that one bracketry thing, and after looking at it, it's like, well, that can't make sense. So we went with that. Well, if we're putting the arm there, why can't we just put it back where it belongs? You know why? Because it's working. One more thing on a 03 pod to let it do it. But these are going to be the predominant cars that we either find. I mean, anybody that buys cars, they're out there about a month ago. eBay. Anybody have any questions on it? Any opinions? Yes.
Don't those newer ones have the internal pump plate on the back? Internal pump plate built have double.
On the 09 and up?
Yeah, they do, the diesel.
They do.
All of them.
09 and up?
Yes.
Depends on the year. The 03s will only have it so far, and then 06s go a little bit further, and 9 and 10 will take you 11 inches from your bumper bracket. So they're 11 or 12 inches. So if you have a 10-inch bumper bracket, and and your internal hump plate, you dimple it right there. You got 1 inch in between.
So these are some things we tell everyone.
I can tell by
But no, this is good. I mean, this is things that sooner or later guys find out. You know, and this is what happens on a track. Guy shows up with a well-built car, like for instance, you pick the right gear, and if you do it right, and you melee everybody, or even if you don't, everyone's like, he's cheating, that back of that car never bent. I'm running an 03 and it's built the same way, and it's pushed clear into wherever. It doesn't mean that somebody's cheating. It means that they got a better car and they built it better. I mean, that's how this works. You build a better car than the other guys on the track, and you use it smarter when you need to. You know, so, but yeah, the 09s and up have a significant, you know, it's a matter of opinion how much better they are, you know, so, but from a certain point, guys, that car having a man, it's got a
It's like a 79 Nova has the same thing inside of the
it's distinctly different, so if you do, the easy way to tell which ones are which is, these two frames look identical right here. The 09 and ups, they got a little extra bracket motor on the side about this big, everybody know that? Not everybody knows that, but you can tell. There is a little bit of a difference between the other ones and the 09 numbers. But on these cars here, I think they're the car of the future. I mean, tonight, if you guys watch the Derby, that's all that's going to be on the track, and the seats all over. Used ones, some fresh ones. And what's really nice, and this is one big advantage that I think about an 03 versus a 98 02. You put, say you put 2 months into building a car, you take it somewhere and you just don't have a good night, and you wad this thing up, down, forward, and you want to do a repair on it, you've got to get your idler arm back correctly. You've got to get your center link back correctly. If you want everything to be right, you got a job getting your steering geometry back. You can do it. We've all done it. The difference is these things here, you stand them straight up in front of that aluminum cradle, cut it off, stick another piece on, you're done. In my opinion, it's the most repairable. These things were made to demolition. You can ruin it up front, take it home, in an hour you can fix it. And what's really cool, most of the frame is the same size, so if you have a junk one laying around and you use a section and you cut a couple holes in it, it looks pretty much like the rest of it. But it's an easy car to fix from here to there. I mean, that you cannot argue. Because you booger the left side of these, where they usually get boogered on the steering box, then you pull it down and you plate it, you still got center link issues, and sooner or later you break an idler arm. So it takes you about 4 times, depending upon how boogered your car is, 4 times the amount of time to get this thing back to where it's steerable correctly versus one of these. I mean, worst case, you bust the rack, 2 bolts, 2 tire rods, fire steering line. I mean, some of the similar parts you got, but you're done. You ain't like, oh man, rain holes, you know, forcing it out, whatever. So if you get comfortable with these cars, they're easy to run, easy to repair. There you go. That's my thing. So that's about all I got. All right. Well, thanks, guys. We appreciate your time. We hope everybody enjoyed this. Got something out of it. So, all right.